Hello and welcome to our last section in our Chapter 39 video lecture series. In Section 4, we're going to talk about transport of gases in human bodily fluids. Our objectives here are to describe how oxygen is bound to hemoglobin and transported to body tissues, and explain how carbon dioxide is transported from our body tissues to the lungs. So we'll start with oxygen transport itself. And our blood's ability to transport oxygen will depend on the solubility coefficient of oxygen. So I want you to know that the gases are going to vary in their solubility in water. For instance, carbon dioxide is about 24 times as soluble as oxygen. Nitrogen is about half as soluble as oxygen, so it does not normally dissolve in blood in sufficient amounts. And gases with low solubility are going to require higher pressure gradients to push that gas into the fluid. So this is going to be very low as far as our oxygen. So very little oxygen actually dissolves in plasma. So we have the presence of hemoglobin to assist with this. So here's our hemoglobin molecule. You can see that it's made up of these 4 different subunits. We have 2 alpha, 2 beta, and each one is going to have an iron molecule. And that iron molecule is vital because it is going to attach oxygen. So if you have an iron deficiency, chances are you're not binding as much oxygen and may be feeling fatigued and breathless. So about 98% of the oxygen in the blood is bound to hemoglobin. And when it's bound, we call it oxyhemoglobin. And when oxygen doesn't bind anymore, let's say we're giving it off to oxygen deprived tissues, then we are going to call it deoxyhemoglobin. So our hemoglobin's binding and releasing of oxygen plays an important role, right? And something you might not have known before is that carbon dioxide also binds to hemoglobin, and binding of it will cause a release of more oxygen from the hemoglobin. So that would cause a lower oxygen saturation within our blood. Our hydrogen binding can also take place on our hemoglobin, and that can cause conformational changes to our hemoglobin, meaning a shape change. And this can cause a decreased affinity for oxygen and oxygen release. So this is called the Bohr effect, and you can see the curves taking place here. We'll look at another one that is a figure in your book on the next slide. But notice how when we have high carbon dioxide, that also causes us to have low pH within our blood, and the oxygen saturation is lower. Whereas if we have low carbon dioxide, then we have a higher pH and we have more oxygen saturation. But we, of course, want to be in homeostasis, and here is our normal carbon dioxide levels and normal pH. So this is a nice figure that your book has that shows that shift taking place as well. We're going to see the incidences of lower carbon dioxide and higher carbon dioxide and pH that we discussed on the previous figure, but what we also see is a shift when we have temperature changes. So for instance, if we have elevated temperature, then it's going to diminish hemoglobin's hold on oxygen, thus causing a shift of this curve over to the right. And this could be due to a fever, or like we said, if we have an increase in hydrogen ion, then it's going to cause a lowering of pH and a buildup of carbon dioxide. And then when we have a shift to the left, this means we have a lower temperature, and this can be due to a decrease in our hydrogen ion, meaning we're going to get lower carbon dioxide and higher pHs, more alkaline. So what are some factors that can also affect binding of oxygen? We know that our carbon dioxide levels, blood pH, and body temperature play a role, as we discussed in the previous slide, but there's also certain diseases that can affect it. First, we have sickle cell anemia, which can change the shape of our red blood cell. Again, we haven't really talked about the red blood cell in detail because we haven't gotten into the circulatory system, but our red blood cell has a biconcave disc-like shape, and what it does is has a genetic change to these cells where the hemoglobin is affected, causing this sickle or crescent shape to the red blood cell. It becomes elongated and stiffened, and that reduces its ability to deliver oxygen. And I don't have an image of it right here, but our capillaries are very narrow, and they're built to allow these red blood cells to move through, almost stacked up like pancakes. So if you have something that is wider like this, it's going to have more difficulty moving through those capillaries and can be very painful. The other condition is called thalassemia, and this is a rare genetic disease that's caused by a defect in either the alpha or beta subunit of the hemoglobin. We see that there's a production of a higher number of red blood cells, and these cells have a lower than normal amount of hemoglobin, meaning we're going to bind less oxygen. Now I want to talk about the transport of gas in the blood and discuss two types of respiration: external respiration and internal respiration. So we said whenever we have that term respiration, we want to talk about gases moving or exchanging with our blood and tissues. So in external respiration, we are specifically talking about the exchange of gases between the lung alveoli and our blood capillaries. We see that our carbon dioxide, which is represented with this molecule over here, is going to have a higher pressure within our capillaries than the air that we brought into our alveolus. So we go from high concentration or pressure to low pressure. And so our carbon dioxide is going to want to move into our alveoli. We see the opposite effect here with oxygen. So we see the partial pressure of oxygen higher in the alveolus than within our capillary. So oxygen is going to diffuse into our red blood cells within our pulmonary capillaries here. So most of our carbon dioxide is carried as a bicarbonate ion. So I want you to look at this equation down here. I've shared this with you before, but it's been weeks now since we've discussed it. So we have carbon dioxide here, and what happens is it combines with water, and I know the arrow is going in this direction, but it also goes back in the opposite direction like we see over here. So just imagine that's a double arrow instead. So carbon dioxide combines with water, and then we are going to be able to use the enzyme carbonic anhydrase to turn it into carbonic acid, and then we pull it back into the bicarbonate ion. This is essentially where our carbon dioxide is kind of hiding, and we have some of the carbon dioxide that does dissolve within the plasma, but to a greater extent we see carbon dioxide as the bicarbonate ion. So in low partial pressure of carbon dioxide environment of our lungs, this reaction tends to proceed to the right side, and we get carbon dioxide as a result. So just to know about that carbonic anhydrase enzyme, it's going to speed up the breakdown of our carbonic acid in our red blood cells. So I forgot to kind of go through this figure over here. So as we have that buildup of the bicarbonate ion here, it is going to move into our red blood cell, combine with a hydrogen ion, and then we are going to get our carbonic acid, which then with the enzyme's help is going to help dissociate into our carbon dioxide and water. Carbon dioxide then is going to diffuse into the interstitial fluid, which then moves across the alveolar wall and into the alveolus for us to breathe out. So what happens in people who are hyperventilating or breathing at a high rate is it pushes this reaction more to the right. I just realized that the previous slide had the chemical reaction in an opposite direction, so I had to correct this and put it in the way that I have in the text here. So it helps to push the reaction over to the right side, meaning that we have excess excretion of carbon dioxide from the lungs, and that's going to mean that we have lower concentration of our hydrogen ion, which is going to cause an increase in pH. So that leads to alkalosis. And here we can see the pH has increased to 7.45, or it could go higher than that if it continues. So what about hypoventilation? This means we are breathing at a lower rate and it pushes the reaction to the left. Again, I had to change the chemical reaction here so we stay consistent. We have less of that carbon dioxide that we are exhaling out. And so as carbon dioxide is kind of building up within the blood here, we are going to shift this over to that left side. So our partial pressure of carbon dioxide is going to increase, which then is going to increase the concentration of our carbonic acid, which then starts to increase our amount of hydrogen ion that we have, and that leads to our pH decreasing and we go into acidosis. So we have a pH less than 7.35, and if it continues, we're going to move down the scale and it can result in death. And this slide is kind of a repeat of what I discussed at the beginning of this section, is that when we have our pulmonary capillary blood low in oxygen, so here we see deoxyhemoglobin, and our alveolar air, meaning the air within our alveolus, is going to have a higher partial pressure of oxygen. The oxygen is going to diffuse through and into our blood and bind to hemoglobin, calling it oxyhemoglobin. So just a little formula here if you like that better to remember that. And then we've got the exchange of gases between our blood and the blood in our systemic capillaries and our tissue cells. This is called internal respiration. Do you remember what external respiration was? It was the exchange of gases between our alveolus and the capillary blood, right? So at this point, we've gone back to the heart with our oxygenated blood, and the heart has pumped out that oxygenated blood, and we've made it over to our oxygen-deprived tissues. So here, the blood that entered our systemic capillaries will typically be bright red, because when oxygen binds to hemoglobin, it turns bright red. We have that pigmentation to it. So once we get down here, our hemoglobin is going to give up the oxygen it's bound to, and it'll diffuse out of the blood and into our tissues. Meanwhile, we'll have the opposite take place, right? Our cells have been going through cellular processes. We have a buildup of carbon dioxide, and it's going to want to diffuse into our capillaries here. So the lower the partial pressure of oxygen is due to, again, those cells taking up oxygen during cellular respiration. Carbon dioxide is produced and starts to collect within the interstitial fluid. So how do we transport that carbon dioxide? We do it in 3 different ways. We discussed how it gets dissolved in the plasma within our blood, so more of that fluid portion of our blood, and that's only 7%. Our carbon dioxide can attach to an amine group of our globin portion of the hemoglobin, so it does not attach to the iron the way we saw oxygen bind. So instead it is the globin part. Think more of the subunit part. And when carbon dioxide binds to hemoglobin, we call it carbaminohemoglobin for that reason. But as I said before, majority of carbon dioxide is carried by the bicarbonate ion, which is dissolved in the plasma. So that's about 70% of our carbon dioxide is traveling through the blood in this way. Our carbon dioxide is going to move from our cells into the erythrocyte, into our red blood cell. And here, carbonic anhydrase is going to catalyze the reaction, turning it into carbonic acid, and then it moves straight into our bicarbonate ion and hydrogen ion. Now, once we form this bicarbonate ion, how are we going to get it out of the red blood cell? We have to do what's called a chloride shift. So essentially, there is a transporter here that is going to take in our chloride while in exchange for the bicarbonate ion. So that bicarbonate ion will then dissolve within the plasma here. And then when we move to the area of our lungs where we want to move the carbon dioxide out of our blood and into the alveoli, we are going to go through this shift again, this time pulling the chloride out into the plasma and pulling the bicarbonate ion in. That then is going to combine with hydrogen to form carbonic acid. Carbonic anhydrase then will move this back and cause a separation into carbon dioxide and water, and the carbon dioxide can then move out of the red blood cell into the plasma through the interstitial fluid here that we have and into the alveolus so we can breathe that carbon dioxide out. Now the last thing we want to talk about is carbon monoxide poisoning. Carbon monoxide, or CO as it's called, is a colorless, odorless gas produced by gas-powered vehicles such as our vehicles and tools, but it's difficult to detect because, again, it's colorless and it's odorless. So we, once that's in our system, cannot dissociate it from hemoglobin because carbon monoxide has a high affinity to our hemoglobin. It wants to bind to it. It loves it. And so it will bind to the hemoglobin over oxygen. So very little oxygen will be transported through the body when this is present. And because it's taking up that space by combining to hemoglobin, oxygen doesn't have the ability to bind to it. So some of the symptoms we see in carbon monoxide poisoning is headaches, confusion, and nausea. And if we have long-term exposure, we can experience brain damage or death because we're not getting oxygen to our vital organs. The treatment for this is to administer 100% pure oxygen to speed up the separation of that carbon monoxide from hemoglobin. So in someone who is going through carbon monoxide poisoning, you could see the higher amount of carbon dioxide that we have, the less saturation of oxygen we are seeing.